Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lisa Gonzalez, and I am the Director of Loss Control at Insurance Board. We are here today with Christy Schiller, who is the Vice President of Account Services at Presidium, our partner in sexual abuse prevention. We wish we could actually be with you in person, but COVID had other plans for us, apparently. We're pleased, however, that we could bring this presentation to you virtually for the General Assembly of PCUSA. I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce Christy and have her tell us a little bit more about Presidium.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today and to share some information about keeping your ministry safe. Presidium has worked with the full range of organizations that serve children, youth, and vulnerable adults for over 30 years now. And our goal really is to help you implement best practices to create a safe environment for everyone. So thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Christy, and we truly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today. I was wondering if we could start off with having you chat with us a little bit more about some of the statistics that exist surrounding abuse, because I know they're staggering and very concerning, and I think it would be beneficial for our churches to learn more about some of those stats.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. It is important just to give everyone a sense of the scope of the problem. Research consistently shows that 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 7 boys experience abuse before the age of 18. And those numbers are staggering. And obviously, we want to change that. The good news is we have some information now that makes it easier to prevent abuse in organizations in particular. But we've probably heard those numbers before, 1 in 4, 1 in 7, and it's real easy just to kind of let those go in one ear and out the other. But when you think about the number of youths that are served in a given congregation, that those are real people. And so it's important to just keep that front of mind. There are other statistics that show 10% of school children experience abuse at school. And one that we don't talk about as much is that 40 to 50% of molestations are actually perpetrated by juveniles. And those numbers have held steady for quite a long time. And that's often surprising to folks, because I think when we sort of imagine someone who would abuse a child in our mind, we think of an adult, right? We think of a bad person. But we know that there are dynamics that produce those sorts of numbers. So it's really important to keep that in mind as well.
Christy, can we talk a little more about youth to youth abuse so people understand the distinction on how that differs from adult to youth? And I know there's a difference between what may be considered sexual curiosity between youth and then actual sexual abuse.
Yeah. Sure. The dynamics are a little different. We know that children don't typically groom each other like we might see an adult do in one of those situations. It's a lot more opportunistic, and it's really just a matter of, is there an opportunity to be alone and go undetected? We see incidents of even very small children in bathrooms or other areas that are harder to monitor. It's tempting to write things like that off to normal sexual curiosity or age-appropriate behaviors. But most of us that work with youth are not experts on that. And it's actually still complicated even for the experts. So we really encourage that, those situations get interrupted. And many of those actually even need to be reported, just like a situation of an adult to child abuse would be.
Christy, can you tell us a little bit more about how churches can avoid creating an environment that makes it easier for youth to youth abuse to occur?
Sure. So again, most of these incidents occur when there is a lack of supervision. And so it's sometimes hard to wrap our head around that when we think about kids running all over the place at church, because it's just like home to them, which is a beautiful thing. But that's when actually more risk can be created. So depending on the activity or the lack of monitoring and really just the lack of planning, it's really important to have a game plan. And you can still do all the fun activities, but how can you really supervise with intention? So, for example, you want to have a plan that adults supervise in such a way that it's not just, well, we have a ratio and we have two adults at everything. Well, what are those adults doing? Is it just that they are there? Or how are we really being intentional about each adult's role? Is one person watching a particular group of youths or a particular area of the facility or the camp or whatever that context is? Really being intentional about how you supervise, just like a lifeguard would at a pool, is how you prevent this type of abuse.
Right, right. I know many churches have very active youth programs and they really love to plan fun activities. Having worked out of a church that served disadvantaged youth for many years, as well as helping start a crisis center for children that served children from birth through 12, I'm very familiar with a lot of the different activities that occur. So there are some specific activities though where churches need to pay extra attention and make sure there's enough supervision provided, correct? So I think it would be beneficial if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we actually run a helpline at Presidium where clients that subscribe to that service call in and kind of have us talk them through situations that come up that are just complicated. And very often those calls are related to youth situations. And we actually track statistics on where these sorts of incidents are occurring. So we actually have some nice data to show where the risks really are higher. So really, anytime you have an overnight activity, uh, boundaries tend to get a little sloppier, and supervision tends to get a little more lax. But adults get sleepy and they're not quite as focused as perhaps we need them to be. So overnight activities, bathrooms, showers. I don't know if any churches have locker rooms, but pretty consistently, this is where we see, because there's that opportunity for privacy and being one-on-one. But even things like a stairwell or unlocked rooms, classrooms that aren't being used. If you have your Sunday school in one class, but there are other places that are open and kids are free to roam, that just creates more risk. So really having a good plan about where the kid's supposed to be, how are we supervising them, and how do we know that people are following those expectations?
That just brought something to mind that I thought would also be beneficial for us to discuss. And if you could give some recommendation on this, typically when you're in these church environments, like you had mentioned, it's very much like a family, right? So um, there's many times where an older child may say, oh, don't worry, I'll run him to the bathroom or I'll take him to the classroom. Could you speak a little about that and the importance of not giving that opportunity to take place?
Absolutely. And there are so many ways that youths can help out with children's ministries. I know at my church, they need all of the kids they can to help with the younger kids in particular. But again, given those dynamics that we know about, 40 to 50% of cases happen with an older child and a younger child. Number one, we don't want to put anyone at risk, but we also want to make sure that youths that are helping out really don't have to carry all of that. It's a lot of responsibility to supervise children, and we want to make sure that they're set up for success. So I think one of my first recommendations would be, don't let youth supervise a group of kids alone, even if it's a very mature youth, a teenager. That's really not fair to them to give them that kind of responsibility. And so just make sure that they're not counted in your ratios. They're there to help the adults, not to be the supervisors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks for sharing that with us. And I know if an allegation of abuse does occur, there is a tremendous impact on a church. So can you tell us a little bit more about how significantly churches can truly be affected by an incident occurring?
Sure. So we monitor on an ongoing basis the outcome of legal cases and that find for the plaintiff. And when we look at those cases, particularly for churches, we just see, the financial impact. And of course, that shouldn't drive why we do all that we do to protect our kids, but it's a very real aspect. And so, very large verdicts. It inhibits your ability to focus on your ministries. It really can grind everything to a halt. We also know it can jeopardize insurability. We see membership decline. Sadly, that reputational damage that can occur is really hard to get back. And some denominations know this very well. No one wants to be part of the church where that happened, to just put it out there like that. But it really is a threat to the overall mission. There have been studies, enterprise risk studies, that look at, what are the biggest risks that organizations face. And one is loss of membership, and number two is consistently an incident of sexual abuse.
Yeah, I know when I ran an outreach program for disadvantaged youth, there were so many wonderful people from the congregation who volunteered and contributed to our program in so many different ways. It's hard for most people to imagine that anyone could be capable of harming a child, let alone the thought of youth engaging in any activities that could potentially harm one another. Can I
Mhm.
think we should talk a little bit about how churches can be more vulnerable.
Sure. Yeah, and ironically, some of the things that make churches so wonderful, is are those things that can make them more vulnerable. With the close relationships, and a trusting environment, and a place where we don't judge. Those are all beautiful things, but unfortunately, that it makes it harder for us to hold each other accountable in that sense. Just for example, churches historically haven't really screened volunteers and employees like other serving organizations. We all know each other, and I've been here for 30 years. What do you mean I need to do this? That's a big culture shift. Um, and again, as we talked about before, really intentional supervision hasn't always been part of the mindset of how we do youth ministry. That's a big shift. And at church, there are so many folks that are being served that may be vulnerable for different reasons, whether it be because they're a very young or very old, or people who are just struggling with things in their life and coming for spiritual direction, and even beyond sort of what happens in the pew, going out into the community. Churches serve more vulnerable populations that way too. So we also see some power differentials, and we don't really like to talk about that a lot at church, but knowing that some people in church really have power and influence that can be leveraged and used to exploit, unfortunately. So but these aren't insurmountable things, but just things to just be able to name and be aware of.
Now, I know that Presidium created a safety equation for organizations in order to create a safe environment for youth. And
Mhm.
I think it's fantastic. It gives very clear directives on what we need to do in order to make sure that we are protecting our most vulnerable congregants. So I think it would be beneficial for us to chat a little bit about the safety equation and share that information with everyone.
Sure. Well, when we think about the dynamics of sexual abuse and prevention, I mean, we're talking about a complex aspect of human behavior, and that's not something that you can flip a switch and everybody just does these couple of things and we'll be fine. It's a lot more complex than that. But in our research at Presidium, over the last 30 years, we were really founded to help organizations have a framework for how to approach this complex risk. Um, Everything ranging from policies, screening and selection, training, how staff and volunteers and youths are monitored and supervised, how you're providing information to the people you serve about not only keeping themselves safe, but what the expectations are. We'll really approach this operationally. And so this framework, and you can learn more on our website about that, but really the goal is to provide organizations best practices in the areas where we know risk is more likely to creep in. So, we're always happy to share more information, and we're going to talk more in a bit about resources that are available to help you fill any gaps to create the safest environment possible.
I think the other important aspect to just mention is that it sounds like that being able to manage these risks takes a sustainable, comprehensive approach that integrates everyone, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's never just one person's job. It's really all of our jobs. And we can have trainings and make sure we're screening and checking all of these boxes. But unless it really becomes part of the culture of our church, it's not going to be a sustainable change. And it takes some effort, but there are a lot of resources there along the way to help.
So, Christy, what are the 5 things that churches can do to help prevent sexual abuse and harassment?
Yeah. Well, Lisa, one of the first things a church can do is establish policies. And it may not feel natural to really get into policy what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of how we interact with each other in ministry. But having those in policy are going to make it really simple for everyone to follow those guidelines and hold each other accountable. Things like electronic communications. We know that there's a lot of risk out there associated with that and forming inappropriate relationships. Having solid policies is going to help make sure that people know what they can and can't do, and it's going to help people know that if they see it, they need to say something. Um, Policies also help create institutional memory. So you may have some really strong folks in leadership right now who are doing a great job with all of this, but people come and go. And so if we have this in policy, we know these good practices are going to be more consistent. Good policies also communicate the importance of abuse prevention and really assures people in your congregation that the church takes it seriously and doesn't want to have a situation where folks aren't safe.
I've spoken with a number of churches about developing their policies to prevent sexual abuse, and I've had various conversations where churches make policies that they aren't really able to necessarily follow. For an example, I've spoken to people that have spent an entire summer working on their policies for abuse prevention and making sure they're doing recommended check ins, for example, throughout the night if they happen to be having an overnight activity. And then they'll mention, you know, but we can't really do that because people are really tired. So we don't really do check ins. Can you talk to us a little bit about why it's so important to make sure that people create policies that they are actually able to follow?
Yeah. I talk to a lot of organizations that struggle trying to find that balance. You want to have best practices, but you also don't want to set yourself up for failure if you don't have the proper resources in place to follow those policies. And that's not to say lower your standards, because I think that's the temptation. And sometimes there are legal folks whispering that in our ear, but it really just points to the need to put more resources toward being able to follow those policies. And what's really nice about working with the insurance board is a lot of those resources are available. So in some sense, there aren't a lot of good excuses anymore for not being able to follow best practices.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Christy. I appreciate it. I know policies are only as good as they are actually followed. So essentially, you're setting internal standards that need to be implemented, and folks need to be held accountable when they drift from them, correct?
Absolutely. And this is the other part that may feel a little unnatural at church. We're going to talk in a bit about responding when we see red flags and concerns. So we'll get to it more there. But at the end of the day, if we're not following these policies and doing the fraternal thing, um, and holding each other accountable, we're really not creating a safe environment.
Okay, so can you speak to us a little bit more about what an appropriate screening process would look like?
Sure. This is an area that's really evolved over the years. I think a lot of organizations feel like, well, we're doing a low cost background check, so we're checking that box and we're good to go. But what we know is to really understand the risk that an individual presents, if given the opportunity to work with youth, is very much behavioral. So absolutely, we have to know that person's criminal history if they have one. But what we really want to do is try to create a behavioral profile. And I'm not saying we need to do a battery of psychological tests, but we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so we really strongly encourage churches to do those interviews and do those references, because that's actually where you're going to get a lot of that good qualitative information. And if you ask those questions in the right way, you're going to get some great information about how that person may behave in the course of their ministry.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up, Christy, because I've had countless calls where people just aren't sure what to do because, for example, they have congregants who have served in a role for many, many years, right?
Yeah.
In a volunteer position, and they just refuse to have a background check now that they might have this policy in place. Sometimes they'll say
Mhm.
things like they don't want to give their social security number, or they become offended because they've been with the church for so long, they just can't
Yeah.
fathom that now the church is actually requiring them to have standards and submit to a background check. So, do you think
Yeah.
that churches should still require a background check for, say, someone who may have been with the church for 30 years?
I've been doing this work for 15 years, and the trend that I've seen is we got a lot of that 15 years ago. Not so much in 2020. This has just become industry standard, and particularly, folks who are parents, they're also doing this if they're going to volunteer at school. They're doing this if they're going to volunteer in their child's sports league. It's pretty normal now, and I think there's a lot of fear out there that may be unrealistic, that folks are going to react in such a way. But at the end of the day, it's really indefensible to tell someone who's experienced abuse, no, we didn't screen this person because they've been here a long time. It also doesn't sound very well in court. So it's one of those things that you just have to do it. And sometimes it takes leadership coming in and reminding everybody why we do this. It's for everyone's safety.
Right. I know that resistance is not uncommon, but probably not as frequent as many may fear it would be. And it
Mhm.
is standard protocol for any organization that serves children and youth. I know I learned a lot about screening questions during interviews, etc., as well as the importance of conducting reference checks when I was going through the Guardian training through Presidium. There have been churches who inquire about why we recommend having these reference checks. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Sometimes three references can really feel like a lot, particularly if you're the person who's trying to chase down folks whose name and email address is given, or however that's brought to you. But I really feel strongly, for those reasons I described earlier, that this is where you're actually going to get a lot of payoff. As important as background checks are, and the spiel that I just gave about why you have to do them, we know at the end of the day there are limitations to them. Um, One, it works under the assumption that someone has been not just arrested, but convicted. And there are a lot of legal reasons why things don't get reported up through the criminal courts. So really getting this good qualitative information about an individual and asking those behaviorally based questions is going to help give you a much better profile of this person and whether or not they have the requisite maturity and skills that they need to work safely with youth.
Yeah, and I know that we have all of those resources available through Insurance Board. Should anyone need, all they need to do is come to our website and reach out, and we're more than happy to share that information and partner with Presidium to answer any additional questions that anyone may have. So we are the resources are there for everyone, correct?
Absolutely, it's there, and again, we're happy to work with the insurance board to provide those because it's not always a natural conversation to ask someone the types of questions that we need to ask, but it's so critical. I just wanted to give a tickle for the board, so I'm curious if any of our attendees have struggled with some of these screening areas that we're talking about. If so, please feel free to share.
Yeah, because we're here to answer your questions and we'd be more than happy to do so. And even if anyone wants to have an offline conversation, I think it's important to remember that we do have a helpline that's specific for PCUSA that they're able to call anytime. Correct, Christy?
That's right. We have partnered specifically with PCUSA through the insurance board with this helpline, and all of that information is available on the PCUSA website as